this area has been quite debatable, and I would like to try to clarify what went wrong with a certain section of critics. But I won't criticize them much. I will just refer to them. So there are some books like Exiled at Home by very famous writer, British Ashish Nandi. The Nandi brothers are not quite kind to Sri Aurobindo. Ashish Nandi about his politics and Pritish Nandi about his poetry. And then there is more than 550 pages book by Partha Chatterjee, which do not even mention the name of Sri Aurobindo. And so sometimes they speak 2 or 3 words or sentences with references to Swadesi movement and Vande Mataram. Then there is one by Dipesh Chakraborty on Jadunath Sarkar, where he starts with appreciating Jadunath Sarkar, then he totally negatives his contribution to Indian history. The only good news for us who are trying to project Sri Aurobindo to the bigger world is this book by Goutam Ghosal. Otherwise, he is not quite nice to his uncle, but in this book he has characterized the idea of country as mother. What is that? And this has become our defense against the line of criticism. Then we have a very recent book by Bipan Chandra and others, which also has the same view, and most of them are very brief, and the index has no reference to Sri Aurobindo, neither it has any reference to Sri Aurobindo's works, and very rarely, and this is very disappointing. A very famous writer, and it is totally negative. And his other book, you know these books because they are respected writers and famous. So this is the situation where Sri Aurobindo's politics is being seen. He escaped, right? That he escaped from Kolkata to avoid arrest. So, and even today I was reading Sachidananda Mahanti, my friend's book, and he was also supporting the view. Being an Aurobindonian, he also was supporting the view. And so I was a bit disappointed by my friend. Now there are 2 important theses which have come out recently. One by Dr. Rima Ghosh from Vishwabharati, and one by Anusha Das, who worked under Devarati Bandyopadhyay. That was an MPhil thesis, and I can't say that the MPhil thesis is not as good as the PhD thesis, because Anusha's work is really good. That is not to degrade Rima's work, and both of them have argued that the political stance of Aurobindo Ghosh and Sri Aurobindo are the same. He is the same. The political stance of Sri Aurobindo and Aurobindo Ghosh is the same. The only difference is the language improved from 1914 onwards when he went to Pondicherry. Sri Aurobindo had problems in his expressions in the Kolkata period. So that created some problem. And Sri Aurobindo himself was not quite enthusiastic about people quoting from his days in Kolkata. He said, no, don't quote them. So in many ways, Rima and Anusha are correct, because I see that the ideas are just, it pass on from Kolkata to Pondicherry. But definitely there is an improvement of language, and that Sri Aurobindo says he attributes it to yoga, which entirely changed his language and his mighty prose works came out between 1914 and 1921. And great architectures and great artistic creations in terms of literature and in terms of philosophy, because he was not a philosopher proper. He wrote mostly from experience. And so they are, in fact, and on varieties of topic. And it is interesting, he was writing the life divine in the morning, and in the evening he was writing the ideal of human unity. It is very strange that a man writing on two different topics, one life divine in the morning and ideal of human unity in the evening. Sometimes human cycle in the morning and essays on the Gita in the evening. And of course, the styles are totally different. Every book has a different style. Now, the question of Sri Aurobindo's politics in Kolkata. Now, I think that it is misinterpreted and or maybe misunderstood. But L.A.K. Boehmer, and it is, the essay is included in Literary Theory, edited by Patricia Wow. He has given a great praise to Sri Aurobindo and Ngugi together, and linking them. Not Ngugi, Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon's book, The Richer of the Earth, came out in 1961, but Sri Aurobindo's series of essays on the doctrine of passive resistance and on decolonizing the mind and colonization of the psyche, these things he had written in 1907, and Boehmer accepts it. That is a good thing for us who are trying to do something a little for the master. Now, there is a lot of misinterpretation relating to the Hindu-Muslim unity and Sri Aurobindo's stance as a religious nationalist, or even Sanatana Dharma, what it is. Now, if anybody in the planet has explained Sanatana Dharma in a single sentence, it is Sri Aurobindo. Even Vivekananda couldn't do that. Because when the expression is problematic, then the message goes wrong to the audience. But Sri Aurobindo is clear, and unfortunately these things are not brought to light. And maybe there is a politics, because they thought Sri Aurobindo is a rightist. And Sri Aurobindo says there is no such thing as right or left, there is only consciousness. You have to see politics from the point of view of consciousness. There is no such thing as right or left. So there is a time when many bad people can do many good works. And there is a time when many good people can do many bad works. This is because of the consciousness at the moment. So leftism and rightism are totally wrong, and unfortunately they took him for a rightist and a Hindu propagandist, and they are unhappy that Sri Aurobindo's words are being misused by certain political parties. But that is not Sri Aurobindo's fault. So let me clarify that Sri Aurobindo was one of the greatest and most sincere friends of the Muslims, because he had held maximum of talks with the Muslims to create a unity, a unified movement, but he failed, and he failed because of the divide and rule policy of the rulers. Unfortunately, Vande Mataram was coming out from Lahore in Urdu, and he had plenty of Muslim followers and fans, in fact. And just for your information, Baba Alauddin Khan was crazy about getting an attention of Sri Aurobindo because he knew his music, his spiritual music, can only be understood properly by one man in India. And he requested Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo said yes. Baba Alauddin Khan played 4 hours for Sri Aurobindo, twice in the morning and twice in the evening. Inspired by it, Abdul Karim Khan, who was a great vocalist and perhaps one of the greatest and the sweetest, because in Kirana Gharana is known for its sweetness, and Abdul Karim Khan was the most expressive of the Kirana Gharana, sweetness. Unfortunately, he died on the way. He was going to Pondicherry and to sing for Sri Aurobindo. So he had a very close touch, and one of the 5 great earliest commentators on Sri Aurobindo's Savitri is an Imam from Lucknow. And many of the Nizam guys, then and now, are Sri Aurobindo's devotees, and Sri Aurobindo has surprisingly many Muslim devotees. Why? Because he was meaning by Sanatan Dharma something else, which of course is. Then I told the government of people who are close to the government of West Bengal that use him now, because people will use him. People will misuse him because it is easy, because very few people have read Sri Aurobindo. And the word Sanatan Dharma is variously, in many tricky ways, misinterpreted by many people, and it is being done still. So what is that? Let me read out from Karma Yogin. Sri Aurobindo wrote it in 1909 when he was not Sri Aurobindo, he was Aurobindo Ghosh. So I thank Rima and Anushwa because they noted it, that the ideas were still there. Maybe Sri Aurobindo's language was not as good as it became after he took up yoga in Pondicherry. Let me read out the part, and this is the best definition of Sanatan Dharma. And I have Muslim students, and sometimes I'm ashamed when they are mistreated. And of course, I'm a critic of all the terrorism that is going on everywhere. But we have to enlighten. They come to us to know. We can't send them away, or we can't be partial in marking with them. We have to teach them, we have to enlighten them so that they become able to understand what this means. This is not Hinduism. Hinduism is a term which Vivekananda had to use, and unfortunately he became known as a Hindu monk. But this is not religion proper. This is a spiritual discipline coming down. Even Sri Aurobindo says, when you don't know, official record is 3,500 years, but you don't know when these things were known to the Indians, to the Aryans. So Sanatan Dharma is, as Sri Aurobindo says, a very short quotation. The Sanatan Dharma has many scriptures: Veda, Vedanta, Gita, Upanishad, Darshana, Purana, Tantra, nor could it reject the Bible or the Quran. Nowhere did they mention this, that Sri Aurobindo was including Quran and the Bible inside Sanatan Dharma. Why? Let me go forward. But its real, most authoritative scripture is in the heart in which the Eternal has his dwelling. So the Eternal Guru is seated at thy heart. That is Sanatan Dharma, because in entire humanity, the Eternal Guru is seated in thy heart. So that way, as Whitman says, we are united. If you read Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, it will give you a fair idea of how Whitman thinks of this unity of all mankind, because of this widening of consciousness, a deepening of consciousness, and a heightening of consciousness. Three things happening in Sri Aurobindo's yoga and Whitman's poetry: a deepening of consciousness, a widening of consciousness, and a heightening of consciousness. This is in precisely Sri Aurobindo's yoga. And it is in our inner spiritual experiences that we shall find the proof and source of the world scriptures, the law of knowledge, love, and conduct, the basis and inspiration of karma yoga. Now, the political parties have distorted these things so much that our Muslim friends have become allergic to these things. So let us not be allergic to Sri Aurobindo, because he is speaking in a different way, in a different idiom, and he's meaning something else. And Sri Aurobindo says that the Gita is not a sectarian text. And his integral yoga, which he prescribes for the world, does not demand a change of religion. This is very interesting, because many people have this misconception that Sri Aurobindo is perhaps asking. My friend Afjal is there. His children are reading in ashram school. But Akmal did not have to change religion, or his children did not have to change religion. The integral yoga is a different thing. It is a transformation, triple transformation of the three layers of consciousness. And this transformation is initiated, helped, captained, led by a force which mediates between the world and above. And here is a point of controversy, because the Quran as it is now, interpreted by the Maulavis and Imam, but I don't believe, because if it comes from Christianity, it must be aware of the mediatrix, the Divine Mary. So there must be mother worship in Quran also, which is hidden, concealed, and not brought to light. And of all these Hindu leaders, I call them Hindu leaders, Tilak, Lajpat Rai, and others, Sri Aurobindo is the only leader who said we need Islam because we need vital force. Muhammad came to give us that. And the most interesting point of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy is that he rejected none. So for many years, from my childhood, from my boyhood, I saw Chennai is refusing Sri Aurobindo. And I knew why. Because Sri Aurobindo critiqued Sankara. He didn't accept Sankara's Mayavad. He said, the world is a Leela, not Maya. But he took forward Sankara to a different angle, to a different corner. He rejects none, but enlightens the past by taking it further. That is his style of criticism. And this is called Niskama in Sanskrit, and Matthew Arnold called it disinterested. So he never rejects the past. And that is why he said that when you talk of excluding the Muslims from India, just keep it in mind they're Indians. I am quoting from Bath Centenary Library Works, volume 26. The idea of two nationalities in India is only a newfangled notion invented by Jinnah for his purposes and contrary to the facts. More than 90% of the Indian Muslims are descendants of converted Hindus and belong as much to the Indian nation as the Hindus themselves. They have the equal rights because they are Indians. And that is why the Muslims are having more faith on Sri Aurobindo, even more faith than Tagore. because Sri Aurobindo was kinder to the Muslims than Tagore. You must have seen Tagore's intolerance about the religion. You must have seen on Facebook, plenty of quotations have come out. But Sri Aurobindo never spoke a word against Islam. And even now, Sri Aurobindo Society gives out a message during the festivals of the Muslim festivals, and welcoming them, and talking of brotherhood which is there in Islam. This process of conversion has continued all along. Jinnah is himself a descendant of a Hindu converted in fairly recent times, named Jinnah Bhai, and many of the most famous Muhammadan leaders have a similar origin. So we are fighting against our brothers. So Sri Aurobindo is a unique leader, and for national integration also, even more important than Rabindranath Tagore. But I don't degrade Rabindranath, of course. They are almost of the same stature, and both have a wonderful connection and rapport. 2 years back, I edited Sri Aurobindo's letter to A.B. Purani. It came out from Rabindra Bhavan Shantiniketan, Rabindra Bhikha. In 1919, Sri Aurobindo, Rabindranath was upset that people were equating Sandeep with Sri Aurobindo. And Tagore was so ashamed that he hastened to write a letter to A.B. Purani, then secretary of Sri Aurobindo Ashram, in 1919, 20th November. I have brought it out from Rabindra Bhavan with my notes. And he was, in fact, very fond of Sri Aurobindo. And from 1918, 1919, after the Jallianwala Bagh, he was desperately trying to meet Sri Aurobindo. And he was a regular reader of Sri Aurobindo's major prose works. If you see Rabindranath's writings in the 3rd volume of the Sahitya Academy volume, many of the essays are echoing Sri Aurobindo's ideas of evolution, of human unity, etc. And then when they met, Sri Aurobindo refused to meet Gandhi. He said, no, I won't meet Gandhi. I have no time for Gandhi. But he gave time to Tagore. He said, well, okay. And he always said, he was always eloquent about Tagore, his lyrics, his poetry, and his theory of poetry is always taking up Tagore for examples. And he was comfortable with Bengali by 1917 when he was writing on Tagore's poetics and poetry, because he couldn't speak Bengali well, but he could read well. So this is the picture of and Tagore's 1917 lectures were blown out of proportion, and that is not Tagore's final idea of nationalism. He was a nationalist. And the last 10 years of Tagore's life, Subhash Chandra Bose's chief advisor was Rabindranath Tagore. Chandrachud Ghosh will be able to tell you. He is writing on the post-1945 life of Subhash Chandra Bose. And Subhash Bose had always a fascination for Sri Aurobindo, and in Gumnami Baba's collection of books, there is a book called Synthesis of Yoga. That is a vital book by Sri Aurobindo. It combines all the different aspects of yoga, of all the world. The Sufi path, the Vaishnava path, every path is synthesized in Synthesis. It's a very, very important book. One of the 3 major books of Sri Aurobindo. And Gumnami's collection contained one book and that is Synthesis of Yoga. And when he left Calcutta in 1941, only yesterday I saw on Facebook that people were doubting he went to Pondicherry. Not that he was always nice to Sri Aurobindo. He was fighting with Sri Aurobindo, quarreling with Sri Aurobindo. I will burn the ashram, people are going to ashram. And there are some differences in the 1940s, and they will be surprised that Abid Hasan, Netaji's lieutenant, Abid Hasan met mother in 1948. Sri Aurobindo Archives, Pondicherry Archives has the record. Who sent Abid Hasan to meet the mother, and mother communicated it to Sri Aurobindo? Abid Hasan came to communicate to the mother in Sri Aurobindo, to Sri Aurobindo in particular, that I knew Hitler was dangerous. I knew Japan might possess India. It doesn't have good intentions, but I was careful. That shows how Subhash Chandra Bose was caring Sri Aurobindo, because he was his guru. Apart from Vivekananda's, Sri Aurobindo was Subhash Chandra Bose's guru. And he sometimes he sought advice through Dilip Rai about yoga, about subtle things, finer things of yoga, how to meditate. And Dilip Rai used to carry the messages from Sri Aurobindo to him. And Sri Aurobindo was sometimes critical, sometimes rebuking him, sometimes said, why? He is not a diplomat. Fazlul Haq is a greater diplomat, he said in the talks. But there was a great love between them. Few people know that. So the final political essays of Sri Aurobindo came out after 1915. I hope I have some time, 10 minutes.
Yes, yes, sir.
So let me shed some light on the two major books of Sri Aurobindo, on human unity and on nationalism, the value of nationalism, because the time has not come to abolish nationalism. Sri Aurobindo says it has to go at one point of time. And I have seen Benedict Anderson is also saying this for a different purpose, that nationalism will stay back. But for Sri Aurobindo, nationalism will stay back because human ego is not yet prepared to abdicate. The ego, His Majesty ego, is not wanting to abdicate, so nationalism will be there for some time. And then he comes to the issue of culture. He says, this is the most crucial point. You should not deviate from your own culture. Unity is okay, but keeping your variety, because every individual has a contribution to make to society. You have to allow him to grow. And that brings me to the question of Sri Aurobindo's theory of education, when he says the child is not a patriarchal property. The child should be allowed to develop freely. In the old idea of patriarchy, the child is a property of the father, but now we are not going to accept it. And there was an important essay by Sri Aurobindo in the Ideal of Human Unity entitled The Religion of Humanity. Once again, the question of Sanatana Dharma comes back. And 12 years before before Rabindranath wrote Religion of Man, Sri Aurobindo wrote the essay Religion of Humanity. And the issues, the themes are identical, the language is different. Sri Aurobindo is, of course, like Tagore, is a master of Bengali, he was a master of the English. And perhaps there is no greater event after Shakespeare in the language. So he wrote in English, and Tagore also wrote in English, but the theme is the same. because Rabindranath was also speaking of Sanatana Dharma in the religion of man. He's quoting at random from the Upanishads, from different Upanishads, linking them with Zoroaster and other religions. And there is a similarity between the two, and I suspect that Tagore was influenced by Sri Aurobindo's essay, because he was in touch with Sri Aurobindo's writings. In Vishwabharati, there was one subscriber for the Arya. And in my early years at Shantiniketan, I saw copies of Arya in the Central Library of Vishwabharati, inscribed with the signature of the Tagores. So they were very fond of each other, and also the link between Subhash Bose and Rabindranath, that is extremely important, because whenever there is a crisis, a problem, Bose used to run to Tagore for advice. And it was on Tagore's advice that Vande Mataram was rejected by Subhash Chandra Bose, because Tagore said it might create problem, it might hurt the Muslim sentiment, certain passages should be avoided. So keep my Janagana Mono. Not because he wanted to keep his own Janagana Mono, but because there were some problems with Bankim's Vande Mataram. Certain passages, not all passages, certain passages might have hurt the Muslim sentiments. And Subhash Bose took it. He admitted, and he kept Janagana Mono as the national song. And both the songs are mantric. But of course, I find Janagana Mono is more incantatory than Vande Mataram. And even the original Shur, the tune was of Vande Mataram, was done by Tagore in 1897 in a session of Congress. So these people were not actually saying, no, Muslims must go out of India. They were extremely connected. They had discomfort with the Muslims because they found them a bit conservative. So they were trying. Sri Aurobindo said, okay, let us go. If they are not willing to come with us, let us go alone and do it. But he was all the time talking to them. And in 1947 speech, he had warned India about the riots that are coming. And it was in a very painful note that he said these things on Trichy Radio in 1947, 15th August, that it is a danger in the sky of India because the Hindu-Muslim unity is not yet solved or resolved. So these are some of the things, and as Rima and Onoshua have rightly pointed out, the language has totally changed. That is why Sri Aurobindo was not willing somebody to quote from Aurobindo Ghosh's writings, because there was a problem in expression. And he will say, the devotees will say, well, Sri Aurobindo has a problem of expression. How can it be? He is a lord of language, he is a born lord of language. But it was like that. If you compare the writings of the Kolkata period and the Pondicherry period, you will see there is a wide gulf of difference between the language. The style totally changed, and it was thoroughly sublime. And he could do anything with the language. He was just playing with the language like anything. And like Shakespeare, he was doing anything with the language, especially in Foundations of Indian Culture. He was very angry with the Europeans. And his main problem was, as Vivekananda said, we as a nation have lost our individuality. We have to get back. And the Muslims are part of us. Like in Foundations of Indian Cultures, he has long essays on the Persian structures. He calls them Indo-Persian structures. And it reminds me of Rabindranath's Jiban Tirtho. Debe ar nibe milabe milibe jabe na fire. Sri Aurobindo was very fond of Persian architecture and of course Sufism. And unfortunately the Sufis are virtually driven out of the planet. They're hiding somewhere. They're true Sufis. And but the Sufis are a way to connect the two worlds, the world of the Hindus and the world. Meanwhile, there is a thing called aggressive Hinduism. This is not Sri Aurobindo's Hinduism. This is different. This is totally politics, and you know where politics has gone today. So if somebody misuses Sri Aurobindo, even then, because people didn't know, I asked our CMs, close ones, come, bring Sri Aurobindo to limelight. Otherwise, other people will use him. And the same thing happened now. Now you can't blame anybody, because if anybody uses Sri Aurobindo, people have come to know that yes, there was a man called Sri Aurobindo, he wrote such and such things. The longest blank verse epic in English literature, 50,000 lines of epic, lyric, blank verse, sonnets, narrative. So unthinkable for an Indian. People will come to know of these things. Sometimes who does for whom, we don't know. A certain force. So this is called the play of forces by Sri Aurobindo. Now this is where we stand now. The thing is, we have to review Sri Aurobindo Ghosh's concept of nationalism, because it is directly linked with internationalism and humanism. And he had a very good rapport with the Muslims, with the leading Muslim leaders. And as I have said, that the great artists were pining for his audience. And Sri Aurobindo obliged them. But Sri Aurobindo refused Gandhi. He didn't want to see Gandhi. He didn't like it. When the Cripps mission was cancelled, Sri Aurobindo was hurt. And Gandhi came to Pondicherry and he wanted to meet him. He sent an emissary. Sri Aurobindo said, no, I have no time to meet Gandhi. So this is my talk today. There is no such thing called right or left. And for nothing, the lefts have done these things to Sri Aurobindo by being silent, by writing things which are not true, and by misusing or maybe they misunderstood these things. I think they can repair. They can think once again that, well, let us see what Sri Aurobindo really meant by new nationalism, what Sri Aurobindo really meant by Sanatana Dharma. Let them explore this. There is one problem which Sri Aurobindo said, that the intellectuals are very difficult to convince unless there is some part of the intuition which is true knowledge. As Blake said, intuition is true knowledge. Unless there is a growth of the intuition in the intellectuals, the pure intellect cannot judge higher things of life. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for your extremely well-researched and scholarly talk, and which is, I think, very insightful. And your lecture today has cast light on areas not known to many. And researchers and scholars may find from your talk new areas of interest in Aurobindo studies. As I was listening to your talk with rapt attention, you have focused on a number of things. You have explained his concept of Sanatana Dharma in great detail and enlightened us about what Sanatana Dharma according to Sri Aurobindo meant. It is actually a spiritual discipline, the approach of which is absolutely inclusive and not exclusive. Then you talked about his concept of integral yoga and his concept of consciousness, the link between integral yoga and the layers of consciousness. You mentioned in detail about Tagore-Aurobindo relationship, Tagore-Netaji relationship, the kind of relationship that he had, a problematic relationship rather, with Gandhiji. And definitely you have talked in detail about Aurobindo's concept of nationalism and his concept of education. So these are some very important areas where we stand today, enlightened by your talk. And as far as the point with which you started, that Sri Aurobindo, according to some historians, quote unquote, escaped to Pondicherry to avoid arrest. Let me just very briefly quote some lines from an article which is written by Mr. Anurag Banerjee, which is recently anthologized in a publication. And Anurag Banerjee is the founder of Overman Foundation, which is a leading research institute dedicated to the ideals of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And there, actually, in an interview on 24th January 1924, Sri Aurobindo is talking to Dilip Kumar Roy, and I quote, Sri Aurobindo says, "I came to Pondicherry because I had been directed by the voice with a capital V, which has led me to develop what I named the integral yoga. It was then that my outlook changed with the knowledge born of my new yogic consciousness," unquote. And Anurag Banerjee in his article points out that on 7th November 1910, and Sri Aurobindo went to Pondicherry when he was convicted for this publication in Karma Yogin. The name of the article was An Open Letter to My Countrymen. And the British government wanted to convict him, wanted to prosecute him. And he went to Pondicherry. But then on 7th November 1910, the news came that Sri Aurobindo was acquitted of all the charges. But then he did not come back. Why? And again, I quote from one of the unpublished letters where Sri Aurobindo says, "I did not intend when I left for Pondicherry to stay and practice sadhana. However, in the same letter he adds that after his arrival in Pondicherry, there took place a fundamental, quote unquote, change in my consciousness, and due to which," he says, "the perception of what I believe in God's will in me came down, and the decision to stay followed as a natural consequence," unquote. So we have to keep these words in mind when we talk about, or when people talk about such a thing that Sri Aurobindo escaped to, or then Aurobindo Ghosh, he escaped to Pondicherry to avoid arrest. I think these are important observations which are coming out, and we should keep this in mind when we try to actually kind of making a re-evaluation of Sri Aurobindo's contribution to India's nationalism and India's freedom struggle and his concept of nationalism.